I said, the presentation is titled Human Dignity as the Way Forward in Europe in the Era of Identity Politics. And before we started recording, I already introduced myself as director of Salux and what Salux is as a foundation for the European Christian political movement, as a platform, pan-European platform for like-minded think tanks. So when it comes to identity politics, there are three types of specific identity politics, as I already mentioned before we started recording, that are most visible at the moment in Europe. And so you have the new class, race, sexual revolution, also known as woke. You have new nationalism that was also very visible in Europe. And then you have the Islamist identity, and that is also very visible in Europe. Now, we'll just mention each of them very quickly, and then go to human dignity, and then to questions and answers. So first of all, we have this topic that Olaf discussed in more detail. The new, as I described it, class, race, sexual revolution, also called woke. So when it comes to identity, it's basically an identity based on the sexuality of your choosing. You choose your own sexual identity. This is what this idea says. It's an identity based on class and race, often, so where you come from. And there's also a rejection. It is a rejection of the white heterosexual norm, as they mentioned that. So this is a very clear, like, where their identity is coming from and what they reject. And then when you look to new nationalism, we can see this in a Trumpist version, or here in Europe in the various nationalist movements. Mrs. Le Pen, for example, is an example, and we see it elsewhere in Europe as well. Then basically you say that in that concept, the identity is based on your nation or your ethnicity. It is saying that, well, everything international, EU, whatever, it's a rejection. They reject it. They reject international institutions and their norms. Brexit is an example of that. Like everything that is an international umbrella of nations, that is a suspect because it is clashing with the idea of the nation in this type of ideology. And subsequently, there is a rejection of the presence of the stranger. And that can be the ethnic stranger, it can be the religious stranger. For example, after the Brexit referendum, there were people who told their Romanian neighbors. So this is not just about, Muslims. There were people in the UK who told their Romanian neighbors, like, you have to leave now because we voted for Brexit and you now have to leave. So that was really what was happening there. So that it is not just the rejection of a different ideology, it's really the rejection of the other, the stranger, who's not like us, and whatever that us may be, according to then their present majority. Obviously, they were very surprised that Spain then said to the Brits, well, now you have to go as well, back to the UK, actually. And they were very, very upset about that because they were Brits and they had the right to live in Spain. And you can see there that at some point things are starting to clash. And so then, as has been discussed in the previous session with Mr. Michael, you also have the issue with the Islamist identity. Now, it's also an identity based on a type of collectivism, but then Islamist collectivism. It is saying, that you can think about the religion, the tribe, the family, and it is also a rejection. Again, it's a rejection of individual rights and freedoms. I've had the honor to cooperate with people who try to do something about the presence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And when you see that happening, and then you can see how this type of extremism in its most extreme shape, of course, because there is all shades between the one and the other. But ultimately, it's the rejection of individual rights and freedoms when you are not fitting in that identity of Islamism. So it is a rejection of other identities. And moreover, when you're a woman, for example, you have to be under the family. So you have no individual freedom in this type of Islamism. And I'm careful here because Islamism, I'm defining it here as a type of ideology or identity. It doesn't mean that every single Muslim thinks like that. That is different. So as Islamist, so as an ideology, this is a very broad summary of that type of identity politics. Now, then we have us as average European citizens. In the midst, and the EU as an institution, EU as a collective of 27 member states, among which the Netherlands, where I am, and Sweden, where you are. And you can see that there's a bit of an issue here. That nationalism and Islamism, they are clashing, and also nationalism with woke ideology. And in part also the woke ideology with Islamism. And the EU is kind of caught up in between of all of that. And a lot of people feel like, okay, where is this all heading towards? And is there any alternative to this kind of clash politics? So when we come to Christians, us as Christians in Europe, in the EU, and the identity challenge, as I said, as I mentioned it, we feel some pressure here. We feel the pressure, especially from the new sexual revolution. Can we still say that we don't agree with the transgender agenda, for example? And there is also fear for Islam. So there is a number of Christians that see the new nationalism as a kind of alternative, as a buffer, so to say, with this kind, against this kind of threatening developments. So that you can think like, okay, if this is coming towards us, perhaps we should join forces with this new nationalism, or we actually feel like a lot of Christians in the US, like, okay, Trump, that's it. That's where we have to go to, and we have to fight against this. Other Christians say, no, this is not the way forward. We have to actually join forces. We have to have a social justice agenda. And there's a lot of Christians like, we're sitting it out and simply think like, let's keep things as they are as much as possible, the status quo. And the question is that then the solution, or are we a witness of faith, hope, and love, a witness of Christ? And how do we do that? By embracing an agenda, opposing an agenda? Or can we define our own agenda? And this is basically where I'm hinting at. And then I'm coming to this alternative road. And the interesting thing is that a lot of Christians are not aware that this is the first article of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Often a lot of Christians sadly think still that like the EU, that's kind of an anti-Christian body. And sometimes the EU tries to affirm that impression, sadly, but often that's not the case. And when you see to Article 1, then it starts with human dignity. Human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected. I think that actually this is not just coming out of thin air. It is actually a principle that is rooted in Christianity. It says that every human being is of intrinsic value. And we as Christians, we say, oh yes, we know where this is coming from. It's coming from this, namely that we are created in the image and likeness of God, the imago Dei. And we can also say, actually, going a bit deeper, that say, actually it's based on Christ. The Word became flesh. So that shows how much love God has for the human being. That God became a human being. That God became man in Christ. That says a lot about the value of the human being. Really a lot. So human dignity is ultimately a Christian principle. And there's been also some recent publications on that point also to that direction, that say, look, actually this whole tradition of the value of the individual and all the rights and freedoms and so on based on that, it's unthinkable that we as Europe and the US and other parts of the Western world, the culturally Western world, would have this principle without Christianity. That's simply unimaginable. Without Christianity, we wouldn't have that starting point. Now, then if we contrast that with the three types of identity politics that we have mentioned. Now, there are some things that these identity politics have in common. The identity of the individual is derived from a collective identity. Because they say, like, okay, you choose your own sexual identity, but when you think about it, it is often coming from ideological categories that are already presented towards people, and that people then start to choose it as their identity. So it's not that individual as it seems. And it is part of a ideological movement. And when it comes to class and race, and when it comes to nation and or Islamist identity politics, it's all derived from a collective identity that is there, and that people, well, are part of, are co-opted in, or are by birth part of. And the problem of each of these three types of identity politics is that they, in various degrees, exclude other identities. And often this goes with a various degree of intolerance, threats, and in the worst cases, even violence. So also what we see in these types of ideology is that these types of identity politics is that they basically at some point their ideology is more important than reality. Like with the woke identity, the biology is deemed as less important than the ideology. In the new nationalism, I've been quite familiar with the Brexit debates because of my function as a European political foundation. I've seen often that a number of realities that are quite obvious are simply ignored or being, pushed aside in this debate because the ideology is more important than the reality. And the same applies to Islamism. The reality of diversity is simply pushed aside, and that is highly problematic. A recent example is, of course, that in Turkey, Erdogan is saying, Islam is against interest, and therefore we should not raise the interest rates. The consequence is that the lira is plummeting almost every day that it is being traded on the exchange. So the point is that in various degrees, these ideologies trump, ignore reality. So these ideologies have an issue in coexisting with the muddy and diverse realities of real life. And they have no space for grace. Because in Christianity, we accept that sin is there and that we are people who need forgiveness. And therefore, we already accept that reality is a bit more muddy and difficult and hard and not always as it should be. Intrinsically, this is incorporated in Christianity, and we call it grace. We call it forgiveness. And this is virtually non-existent in this type of identity politics. They don't know precisely how to deal with the imperfect and the difference. And each of these types of identity politics see human dignity as an outcome. But they lack human dignity as a universal principle and underground as a fundament, so to say. And therefore they struggle to have common ground with others who think differently. And I saw what Olaf presented. He was so kind to send it to me, and he mentioned there in what he presented that he said that in a recent article on the woke revolution, and there is a describing of that revolution that says persuasion, the point of debate, is replaced by public hanging. Moral complexity is replaced by moral ambiguity. Facts are replaced by emotions. Ideas are replaced by identity, and forgiveness is replaced by punishment. Debate is replaced by deplatforming, and so on. Diversity is replaced by homogeneity, that everything is homogeneous and everybody has to think the same. Inclusion by exclusion. So it shows that there's a problem, because you can also say that in more or less different degrees, the same applies to the new nationalism and Islamism. If you don't have human dignity as starting point, but as outcome, ultimately you run into trouble. And then that rejection of a common ground leads to a situation in which the debate indeed becomes deplatforming. It becomes a mere power struggle between those who can amass the most followers at a specific moment and shout the loudest at a specific moment, or are more aggressive than their opponents at a specific moment. And then it becomes really a clash. a power clash, a power struggle. Who can shout the loudest? And that is clearly destructive. And also, in addition to that, due to this lack of deeper common basis, there's often a lack of thinking it through. I've been sometimes absolutely perplexed by the tolerance of some of the activists, of the woke activists towards Islamism, who in its own right is absolutely not tolerant to those groups that a woke ideology wants to defend. And let me be clear about one thing here. When I'm talking about a woke ideology, I'm not dismissing a number of the issues that they try to raise. I'm simply saying that they probably try to raise it in the wrong way. Now, for example, when we talk about race and discrimination and racism, I think we have to face up to that. And I think we have to face up to the past and as well as the present realities of racism. And then we have to find a better way to do that. So why human dignity? Well, human dignity is focused at the reality of the human being. It is not abstract like an ideal that you strive for, but it's simply you and me, that we are there. We're not abstract. You sitting in the pews, me sitting here, we are concrete human beings. In that sense, human dignity is non-ideological. It is simply there. And intrinsic value means no other requirements needed. You don't need to be anything else than you to own, so to say, to have, so to say, human dignity. Human dignity is there in you. It's there. And you could say, no other requirements needed. You can, as Christian, you can say, okay, I know that. It's called grace. It's called grace. It's universal. No human being is excluded. So that's why I think that this is actually a better way to address racism. Because we're all part of humanity. And it's relational. And I'm quoting here Desmond Tutu. My humanity is caught up and is inextricably bound up in yours. For we can only be human together. I can only be human if I recognize your humanity and vice versa. And of course, as Christians, we recognize that it's this relational understanding as imago Dei, human dignity. We know that. It's called the Trinity. And then human dignity respects the freedom of people and communities. So you can think differently because human dignity automatically excludes, if it excludes anything, it excludes oppression. It rejects, in principle, oppression. So if you're forced to think as individual or as community different than the rest, because the rest thinks that you're thinking it wrong, and then force is applied, that force is already against human dignity. Now, human dignity means that we do not need identity politics to reaffirm and strive for the realization of the intrinsic value of life. It makes it actually obsolete. And human dignity means that we do not need another group identity to reaffirm our own intrinsic value as human beings. Why? That's simply redundant. And human dignity understood as a relational message is the basis for a Christian alternative to the divisive identity politics. We can be together as we are. We will still have our differences. We'll still have our disagreements, for sure. But at least we have a common ground. And there where we can agree on whatever issue that is, well, then we can work together. And where we don't agree, we don't agree. Well, life goes on. No disaster happens when we disagree. If we can allow each other to exist in disagreements. So that's a big challenge. But there is more than that to say. Because human dignity understood as a relational message, it's not just about aid and outreach. It is equally about politics. It's a Christian basis for involvement in the EU. And it offers hope to the EU. This is where I want to finalize. Christians can, through this approach, remind the EU of its own roots, its own Article 1, and where that's coming from, its own values, and offer a way out of the destructive divisions that plague our continent. When the Commission had its communicative debacle last week in publishing these guidelines for their communication, which was an unfortunate event, then they had to pull it back. So I was contacted by several Christians like, oh, we have to protest against this. We have to stand up against this. And I was like, no, let's not do that. First of all, the Commission already pulled it back, so why should we? It would be a display of a lack of grace if we would then still go after them. But also, perhaps we should reconsider first how we would approach that. Will we approach it defensive, offensive, or are we trying to have a conversation about diversity and what that actually means? And how can we live together as different communities? And how can there be indeed inclusive language without excluding the Christians of Europe, for example? Now, there's a lot that can be done there. And this is, as I said, it is not the whole truth and the whole truth. This is a beginning or an attempt to give an answer. But my biggest point is actually that there could be an alternative to the defensive or offensive attitude. That we could have actually something to offer beyond that. And a lot of people, I think, are looking for human dignity, are looking for hope, especially in the times that we are in. And I think that we can offer that. And that identity politics, as it is now, is ultimately in all its forms a dead end. Because it will at some point bump into reality, and then it shows that it can't work. But human dignity, relations, human relations, and all that comes from that will always work. That will always work. There is no reality that human dignity cannot deal with. There is no reality that is not relational. So we have a lot in store as Christians in Europe, in our own faith. And the question is, how do we share that? Now, then there's a whole multitude of answers to that, of course, but I think you get more or less the point. So that's how I want to close it, with hope, not with vision or fear or how we can counter this, but rather to say, okay, how can we offer a way out for many people?